Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. Les Payne, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, is a former editor and columnist for Newsday. He was responsible for national, foreign, and health and science news at the paper for a quarter-century and served as the editor of New York Newsday. His news staffs won every major award in journalism, including 5 Pulitzer Prizes. The inaugural professor of the David Leventhal Chair at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism has received 4 honorary doctorate degrees, including one from his alma mater, the University of Connecticut. The author, editor, and social critic delivered the prestigious H.L. Mencken Lecture at the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore and lectures frequently about social and political issues, the future of journalism, African art, and liberation movements in the U.S. and in South Africa. As the founder and the 4th president of the National Association of Black Journalists, Payne has worked diligently to achieve media fairness, improve employment practices, and to expand the coverage of Black and Third World communities. As a rookie reporter, Payne organized the Black Caucus at Newsday and later co-founded the Trotter Group, a national organization of African American writers of newspaper commentary. He started his career as Babylon Town beat reporter, then copy desk editor, editorial writer, assistant editor of a summer journal, special writer for the feature section, investigative reporter, national correspondent, deputy managing editor for national and foreign news, and syndicated columnist. Payne, along with 2 other Newsday reporters, won a Pulitzer Prize after investigating the international flow of heroin from the poppy fields of Turkey through the French Connection and into the veins of drug addicts in the New York City area. Spending more than 6 months in Europe and Asia on the story, he reported from locations such as Istanbul, Turkey, Munich, Cyprus, and Nice. The 33-part Newsday series was also published in book form. Some of his other major investigations include migrant farm laborers on Long Island, involuntary sterilization of Black women, U.S. atomic testing in Nevada, illegal immigration, the Black Panther Party, and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He is also the author of The Life and Death of the Simeonese Liberation Army, the revolutionary band that kidnapped newspaper heiress Patty Hearst, gunned down educator Marcus Foster with cyanide-tipped bullets, and otherwise terrorized the West Coast. In the wake of the 1976 Soweto uprising, the United Nations-based correspondent traveled throughout South Africa and wrote an 11-part series that the Pulitzer Prize jury selected for the 1978 Award in International Reporting. However, the advisory board, in a controversial move, secretly overturned the selection. The action caused a scandal and, following a Newsday investigation, led to reforms in the jury selection process. It would have been Payne's 2nd Pulitzer in 4 years, an accomplishment unprecedented at that time for a reporter. As a result of Payne's disclosures, Pretoria officials barred his re-entry. However, he managed to slip back into South Africa to cover the social revolt Africans mounted in the 80s to bring about Black majority rule. After the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, the besieged white minority government officially invited Payne back into South Africa to bear witness and to write about the historic forced ending of apartheid. Earlier, Payne had reported on the military and economic changes in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, where, in 1977, he was the first journalist to visit areas held by the guerrilla forces of Robert Mugabe. His Africa reporting covered Mali, Nigeria, Uganda, Mozambique, Tanzania, Botswana, Guinea, and Zambia, to name a few. Payne's other awards include the $10,000 UN World Hunger Media Award, Columbia University's Tobinkin Award, the 2009 Aronson Lifetime Achievement Award from Hunter College, 3 Unity Awards from Lincoln University, the inaugural Howard University Journalism Prize, the Headliner Award, 2008 induction into the National Association of Black Journalists Hall of Fame, and more than 200 other prizes from civic organizations, professional groups, high schools, and universities. A former TV panelist on WCBS's Sunday Edition, Payne has also appeared on numerous radio and television shows, including The Caldwell Chronicle, Nightline, Good Morning America, McNeil Lehrer, Democracy Now!, Meet the Press, Washington Week in Review, Bill Donahue Show, Gil Noble's Like It Is, Straight Talk, Up Front, Black Horizons, BET's Straight Talk, and CNN Year in Review. On numerous occasions, Payne has served as a juror for the Pulitzer Prize and as a judge on the Blue Ribbon panel selecting the news and documentary Emmys for the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. Serving 6 years as a Ranger in the United States Army, Payne attained the rank of captain and commanded a Nike Hercules anti-aircraft missile battery. During an assignment in Vietnam, he ran the command newspaper as an Army journalist, and he wrote messages and speeches for U.S. Commanding General William C. Westmoreland. He is in the process of completing a biography on Malcolm X and is a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, TheRoot.com. It is an honor to welcome you to the show, Mr. Payne.
Good being here.
I'm going to begin by revisiting the period when you worked as an Army reporter. As you know, reports of sexual abuse and misconduct within the military are at record levels. Given the fact that you took an oath to serve your country as a member of the United States Army, would it have been virtually impossible for you to report on sexual abuse or misconduct if you had been presented with irrefutable proof at the time?
Well, the concept of an Army reporter is almost an oxymoron. I was what was known as an information officer, which is the Army's version of a journalist, all right? But it bears no bearing to journalism at all. I remember when I reported to one of my commanders, who was an Air Force colonel, and he said to me, this is the Army, and I don't want to hear any of this E.B. White bullshit.
Really?
This is not journalism. So I think, yes, we ran a newspaper. Yes, I've worked on newspapers in the Army. These are usually command newspapers that go out to the troops, and they have a very strong, propaganda component to them. It's not journalism. So, I would say Army journalism in that sense is the journalism what Army food is the food, and hardly that, because at least Army's food is food. But in terms of your question, though, no, they couldn't report. They wouldn't report on that. And if they did, they wouldn't do it openly because, any more than Catholic newspapers report on sexual abuse by the Catholic Church or the Vatican newspaper. I should add, by the way, in the old days, nor could mainstream newspapers report on, say, abuses in journalism, for instance, racism, within newspapers. And that was one of the things that we faced. For instance, here in New York, all three so-called daily newspapers, well, two of them, New York Daily News was sued, for racism, case settled, and went to jury and found guilty of racism. The New York Daily News, the largest circulation paper in the country at that point. But would the Daily News report properly on racism within journalism? No. Would the New York Times? No. The New York Times was sued for racism in a case called Rosario versus New York Times. And the New York Times, could it report on itself? So the question you raise is, can an organization report, or an institution or an industry report fairly, clearly, quote unquote, objectively on itself? Of course not. The Army cannot. Newspapers cannot on itself. And the history of this is pretty clear. And I don't want to, by saying this, equate the inability of newspapers or unwillingness of newspapers to report on its own abuses, but with that of the military. But I think that one of the things that is required for fair, honest reporting is independence. Another thing that's required is competition. Another thing that's required is a sense of objectivity is not possible, but I think one has to be removed. One cannot be conflicted. So the Army would be conflicted. So you can't count on the Army to report on sexual abuse in the Army. You have to get outside sources to report that, as with abuses of any other institutions.
You were charged with the task of covering the King assassination. Did you approach the story from a basic reporting standpoint or with a specific angle in mind?
Well, some years later, and I remember in 1975, there was a House committee that had looked into the King assassination, and it disclosed for the first time that Martin Luther King, through the last 5 years of his life, was followed by the FBI 24 hours a day. And so that was revealed in the newspapers. And so then it opened up a whole deal. Well, were they following me? What was this about? And so I and others began to look into the assassination of King at that point. The New York Times put a team of reporters on it. They had three of their best reporters Crudston, Franklin, and Nick Horrick. I remember the names. They conducted the New York Times investigation into the assassination of Martin Luther King. This is in 1975. And so they came back and said it was James Earl Ray acting alone that had killed Martin Luther King. And I was skeptical of that. And so I had gotten permission from my editor to conduct my own investigation. I remember he asked me, he said, well, what can you find that the New York Times hasn't found? I said, well, maybe we could find the truth or get closer to it. So I conducted an investigation of Martin Luther King with the purpose of finding out what happened. Who's James Earl Ray? Did he act alone? Did he have any help? How did he get all the way to London without being found? How did he get away from the scene? And I looked into all of those questions and wrote about it. By the way, my conclusions that I wrote was taken. I did not find out everything, but I found out some new information. And I went to the Congressional Black Caucus. I went to Louis Stokes, who was a congressman from Ohio, and I told him that I had some information that was new. I showed him the information that I had written in Newsday, and also showed him a piece of information that I had not written. I went to him, I went to Jesse Jackson, I went to Fauntleroy, and I tried to go to Mrs. King. She wouldn't talk to me. But I asked King disciples if they could try to form a House assassination committee and put certain people under oath. In other words, subpoena them and put them under oath. Because as a reporter, even if I found them and I had not found them, I couldn't question them on the oath. So Louis Stokes was very forthcoming. And at the end of the day, to fast forward, I mean, my information was taken by a couple other people and stolen as their own. But at the end of the day, my work was at least in part responsible for the House Assassination Committee, which looked into they said, well, we're not going to look into the assassination of King, the compromise at the House back in those. So they formed a House Assassination Committee, and they looked at the assassination of Kennedy, President Kennedy, and King together. Fauntleroy was the chairman of the one, Louis Stokes was the chairman of the other. And so they investigated. And the guy that I wanted them to investigate and put on the oath, they did in fact put on the oath. And until this hour, his testimony is sealed, and you cannot read it. All right. Now, who was he? His name was Morrell McCullough. This is what I had found during my investigation in 1975, 1976. Morrell McCullough. This was the first time it had been repealed. Now, what we knew is that there was an undercover police department guy named Ed Reddick. I wrote about him public in Newsday. The one that I did not write about was Morrell McCullough, whom I can name now. Morrell McCullough was a federal agent, black, who was on the scene at Lorraine Motel on April 4th, 1968. And when Dr. King was killed, he ran up the stairs while everybody was pointing everything. He was the last one to essentially verify that King was dead. All right, on the steps. All right. And he also, in the FBI files, established the trajectory of the bullet. It was he, Morrell McCullough, this federal agent, former military guy, who was from, if not Memphis, certainly Tennessee. He verified that the bullet came from the flop house window. But the point is, he was a federal agent. What was he doing up there under whose instructions and da-da-da. Now, he was called, I remember Fauntleroy, who was the chairman, they put him on oath, and they subpoenaed him everything, and they sealed his testimony. They cleared the room and sealed his testimony. And I have not read his testimony until this day. But at the end of the day, I think what the conclusion of the House Assassination Committee was, and by the way, they needed, I think, $5 or $15 million to complete their work. But what they found is that James Earl Ray, that there had been and I think this is really what happened, by the way, that there had been a $50,000 contract that was let in St. Louis by a group of businessmen. This is what the House Assassination Committee found, which was formed in part because of my work. But they found that there had been a $50,000 contract let in St. Louis, and the question is, did James Earl Ray find out about it? Was he out, in addition to other things, his own ambition, was he also out to collect that $50,000? And did he get any of it? This is what they never really found out. And so mainly because, to get back to your first question about can the military investigate itself? No. Can it report on itself? No. Can the FBI? No. The FBI, the federal government, had conducted 5 separate investigations and cleared itself each time. And it heavily influenced, and intimidated that House Assassination Committee, which supposedly should have been free of the Justice Department. But this is what journalism is all about, is getting to the fact of the matter. And usually I find increasingly that those areas that involve African American people kind of go halfway, if that. and I think there's a great need for, I suppose, not just the kind of work that you're doing, but I mean, there's a great need for people who have access to and concern about and passion for getting to the whole story. When it comes to people like King, when it comes to people like Malcolm, when it comes to people like what really happened, in South Africa to Nelson Mandela, etc.
You also covered the Black Panther Party. What's the biggest difference between the organizations from the 70s and the current groups?
Which current groups? I'm trying to think now. Which current groups?
They have the new Black Panther Party.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, which was ascended from it, I think had a sound beginning. I think that Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, those two students, out at Merritt College out in California, I think they were well motivated. I think they saw themselves taking action on what Malcolm X essentially talked about and what George Jackson essentially wrote about. And so, but Malcolm chief and fundamentally, they saw themselves being the children, of Malcolm X, and George Jackson in a way, also. I think that they had a broader Marxist-Leninist kind of nourishment, but I think the real thing is that, I think it was an authentic group. I think that the Black Panther Party, the impulse that brought the Black Panther Party into existence was an authentic impulse that needed addressing Black suppression and oppression in this country and abuse, by mainstream America. So I thought it was authentic. I think that Huey Newton was a very smart guy. I interviewed him in San Luis Obispo prison when he was there for having killed that policeman in Oakland. I interviewed Bobby Seale back in those days. He was at Alameda County Jail and elsewhere. And I think that these two young men had an authentic founding. I think that the organization was destabilized by the FBI. It was infiltrated heavily. It was a main target of COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program by the FBI. And the FBI was scared of it because they saw them as a threat, as they saw King as a threat. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover was called King, one of the most dangerous men in America. Can you imagine? Martin Luther King. And Malcolm X was beyond that. And so the federal government, the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, destabilized and targeted those guys. Now, that is not to say that Huey Newton did not kill that cop. He did, in fact, shoot that cop, but his conviction, as you know, was overturned. He was let out of prison. But I think that the Black Guerrilla Army formed, from that group. I thought that they were an authentic group addressing police abuse. They were addressing the imposition of drugs in our community, by mainstream government, on and on.
Your landmark series, The Heroin Trail, earned you a Pulitzer Prize in 1974. But ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC News, among others, have recently done reports on the resurgence of heroin in America. In March of this year, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder called heroin overdoses an urgent and growing public health crisis. If there was one thing you could cite as the reason for the drug's comeback and ever-increasing popularity, what would it be?
Heroin is a depressant. Cocaine is an upper. Meth, I understand, is an upper. I mean, so I think alcohol is a downer. So I think that the heroin really puts you in a stupor. I'm no expert on the current usage, but I certainly was an expert on its usage back then. I think that there's a lot of money to be made. I think there are a lot of people who want to get away from reality. So when you go to the hospital and they give you opium, they give you usually opium to put you out of your reality, to relieve your pain. So I think that there's an increase in pain, there's an increased need for people wanting to escape, and therefore there's an appetite, for those drugs. And once that appetite increases, particularly in a capitalist country where you have people with a lot of disposable income, then I think that the people who grow it, whether it's in Colombia or whether it's in the Golden Triangle, which is where heroin used to be grown, you can grow it elsewhere. I think that they find reason that billions and billions of dollars to be made. And what we found when we looked at heroin back in the 70s was that it was the most profitable product in the world. It was more expensive than gold. Heroin was back at that point. And that was one of the things that we looked at. And I should say that the motive back then was right here in New York City in 1971, there were 1,100 heroin-related drugs. They said overdoses, but it wasn't really overdoses. because, really die of an overdose of heroin per se, but it was, complications, either infections or it had been mixed with impurities, rat, roach, powder, anything that looked powder, they would mix it, so a lot of impurities was in there. But anyway, 1,100 deaths in New York City, 1,100 deaths in 1971, when we began to look at the heroin epidemic in 1972.
Primarily in the black community?
Primarily in the black community here in New York. Think about it, 1,100 deaths. And that's not to say the people who were injured and hospitalized. That's not to say the people who were hit in the head, and ladies coming home from church who was hit in the head and their pocketbook stolen, houses broken into, people mugged, which was high. And by the way, the key thing that I found in that area is when heroin at that point in the 70s, in the late 60s, were restricted to the black community, there was no outrage. 1,100 deaths, in New York City, there was no outrage. 1,100. And the homicide rate in New York City, roughly the same population, is less than 500. And twice, almost 2.5 times that were dying just from heroin-related, and people were not outraged because they were blacks mainly. And we didn't have the facility, to voice our outrage, which is to say that the media didn't, radio and television didn't care over much. The black newspapers was overrun in trying to deal with it. But as for reasons why it's coming back down, two reasons people take drugs. One, they take them recreationally, so that they feel better about being out, partying, hanging out, stimulated in some ways when they are not privately and when they're in private relationships. And the other one is to escape. And I think that once you resort to it as an escape mechanism, I think that that's a serious problem because you want to escape from reality. So, and I think that's heroin addresses that need, say, as opposed to cocaine, which is a stimulant.
Your reports on South Africa, particularly those on the Soweto uprisings, earned you a Pulitzer Prize nomination for foreign reporting in 1976. You met with the late great leader Nelson Mandela. Is that correct?
I met with him in 1990 when he was released.
What immediately came to mind when you received word of his death?
That the king has died. I mean, this was I can think of no one, quite measuring up to the cumulative contribution that he made to his country and the world. In fact, a former editor of Newsday asked me if there was an American parallel, and I couldn't think of one. And the only one I could imagine was that if, say, Frederick Douglass had been elected president of the United States, back in the 19th century, then you may have something coming close, to it. When I was over there in 1976, his name was barely mentioned because it was illegal to mention his name. People were not allowed to mention his name. His name could be published in the newspaper. They couldn't mention it on radio or television. So when I talked to the youngsters of Soweto, they knew who he was, but his name wasn't mentioned a lot. They mentioned some of their current leaders, Biko, Tsietsi Mashinini, Kotso. These are some of their young leaders. And so their young leaders were aware of the generation of leaders, Godwin Mbeki, Walter Sisulu, Sobukwe. The two major ones were Robert Sobukwe and Nelson Mandela. Africans would only whisper about Nelson Mandela. When he was released in 1990, and he was released because of the enormous pressure internationally that had been put on the South African government, including sanctions, economic sanctions by the U.S., which was passed over Reagan's veto, all of that, of course. He was like a man coming back from the dead. That's what the Africans saw. It was just one of the most amazing sights because I was privileged to have been there when it was released in February of 1990. And to travel around, I was in Bloemfontein, I was in Johannesburg, I was in Soweto, I was in the Cape Town area, and I was in those crowds. He spoke at a soccer stadium, in Bloemfontein, and I mean, it was just unbelievable. I mean, it's just beyond tears. I mean, it like they all knew of him, particularly the adults, I would say. He had been gone for 27 years, and I don't want to say forgotten, but he was a martyr to the cause. So it was as if the martyr had come back to life. Just to see it and to hear and experience it and to watch the Africans, look upon this martyr, just walking among them. It was a really extraordinary venture, and that's what I saw, and I cannot even imagine anything like that happening again, although it might.
How did you end up becoming a panelist on the WCBS Public Affairs program, Sunday Edition?
It was a local version of the Brinkley Show. First half hour, they talk about news events in the city. In the second half, they had journalists sitting around talking. And one of those quote-unquote journalists was Ed Koch. Now, Ed Koch had been the mayor of New York for 12 years, and I had battled him constantly as a columnist. I used to write about him vociferously in my column. And he put me in his books. I mean, we had a running war going back and forth. It was like the war I had with Imus and others, you know. But anyway, we had a war going back. I would write about him because I thought he was a pernicious mayor in terms of black New Yorkers. After he left the mayor's office, WCBS put him a panel on his show. And among other things, they would critique the performance of the current mayor, and the current mayor at that point happened to have been Mayor Dinkins. I said, holy cow, this is unbelievable. The former mayor, 12 years, sitting around critiquing it. It's like a woman's first husband giving a shot at critiquing her second husband. It's just, his successor. Yeah. It's just unbelievable. And I thought, absolutely crazy. I didn't write about that, but it was observed by people. Now, Bob Herbert was on that panel. All right. And one of the things that I used to observe is that Bob Herbert, I thought all too often would say, well, I agree with Ed, and then go on to make his point. And I was just, oh, please, Bob, don't say that. Even if you agree with him, don't say you agree with him. Just go ahead and make your point. There were people who went to WCBS and said, look, this show is unfair to the mayor, and criticized him. They didn't say you can't talk about him because he's black, but said they're making unfair comments, and the fact that you have Koch out there is just unspeakable. And they said, well, what do you suggest? And he said, well, we need a black voice on the show. Now, one of the people who told me this and was one of the leaders was Roscoe Brown. Roscoe Brown, who's at Brock Community College. You know, he's former Tuskegee Airman. He led a black delegation, let me call it, into CBS to complain about the unfair critique and criticism about people, including former Mayor Koch. And so he said, the way he tells it to me, he said, well, what do you recommend? He said, well, I think you need a black voice on there. So they said, but we have Bob Herbert. And Roscoe Brown said, the group said, but we need a black voice on there. He said, but we have Bob Herbert on there. He said, but we need a black voice on there. And at that point, Bob Herbert, had been with the Daily News, and he was pretty milquetoast, mealy mouth. And I know him. I won't say he's a friend of mine, but I know him. But at any rate, he was not particularly. He was a guy who, as so many blacks, in retreat from being distinguishable from the white panelists. You see, most black columnists are that way. Not all, but most. Very few exceptions. Increasingly more now, but back in that day, they're mainly milquetoast people who wanted to out-whitewash, white columnists. So, for a reason, I'm not saying that, and therefore they got rid of Bob Herbert, but for whatever reasons, he left. And they had two candidates, I understand. It came down between me and Playfell Benjamin. They had me on a time or two, and then they had Playfell Benjamin on a time or two. And so they had to choose between me and Playfell. For whatever reason, they chose me. So that's how I got on the show. And interestingly enough, that was a big drama because it was known in New York that Koch and I had a running, not a feud, but a battle. My columns attacking him, and he would write letters to the editor asking me to be fired and da-da-da-da-da-da. And he even I made a couple of his books, that he mentioned, and that's fame. So I was asked, on the eve of being appointed to the show, well, what do you think about being on the show with Mayor Koch as a fellow panelist now? I said, well, as far as I can remember, my quote was in the paper was that I think it's going to be interesting chemistry. And for whatever reason, he dropped from the show, Koch. A couple of times he came as a guest, but he and I'm sure on his own because they wouldn't have the nerve to get rid of him. In fact, they were looking forward to it. Jim Jensen was the host, and but Koch and I never really sat together as a panelist, and I'm sure it was his choice. He decided he had probably better things to do.
Speaking of Jim Jensen, what's your fondest memory of the former host?
No, he was a great guy. He was fair, he was honest, he was open, he was frank, he was forthcoming. He exposed himself a lot, and I rather like that about him. I think that he was a throwback to the old time anchor. He didn't have Eric Severod's intellect, but he did have his kind of presence, the presence of the anchor. He was like in those days what you think an anchor would look like. He had a sense of command, the news. He has a presence, when he gave the news. And I thought he was in the mold of Cronkite and Brinkley and those guys.
He reminded me a lot of Roger Grimsby.
Yeah, but I thought they got into Happy News there for a while, Happy Talk. And no, Gil Noble didn't like that at all. when they were just joking on the air and making light of news. But, but that was just a change. But no, I respect Joe Jensen a lot.
If you could travel back in time to report on a historic event that changed America, what would it be?
Well, I missed the Civil Rights Movement, because I was in college and then the Army. So I missed the Civil Rights Movement, certainly the beginning of it, Montgomery King assassination. When Malcolm was assassinated in 1965, I didn't cover any of that. I suppose I would like to have covered that period. It was a very, very interesting time. So I came in on the tail end, of that apex. But I suppose other than the period, I like the one I covered, by the way. I covered the Panthers, I covered the Seminolese Liberation Army, I covered the formulation of black parties. I think I have a pretty good view of how America got to its first African American president. So I think I called a lucky streak. And I think most journalists, you want to cover something where some conclusion is reached and some conclusion that is an improvement. And I think that we're in it now. I think that in terms of African Americans, because and therefore America, because America's great birth defect is slavery, racism. And I think that whether or not this birth defect of racism, which was at the founding of this country, whether or not it will prove to be a sickness unto death, is yet to be determined. We still don't know that. It quite possibly will be. I'm not at all sure that it won't be. But I think that what would be heartbreaking would have been to cover, some of those, say, Reconstruction period, in which there was so much hope, at the end of the Civil War, at the so-called release of the slaves. And that was a very high point. And then right away, the power forces moved in and stopped it,
Black
dead.
Codes.
Yeah, with Jim Crow laws and Reconstruction, which was the failure of that period. That would have been heartbreaking as an American for me, and as an American period, as on this thing. I think that there seems to be an upstream now, which I like. What I'll say in terms of that sweep of American history, and which to say the total sweep of American history from its founding, the slave days, is that I think that, and I saw a version of this in South Africa, that a country can go against right and survive, and can even flourish. Slavery was wrong, but this country it survived for 250 years. So the country, America, was founded, went against what is right and what is humane and what is civilized, went totally against it. And yet it thrived, for 250 years. I think it thrived because history was on its side. That's the way the winds were blowing. Colonization was blowing. They were colonizing Africa, they were colonizing Asia, they were colonizing South Asia, colonizing China, they being Europeans. And I think that you can go against what is right and win. I think you can go against history and win. But you can't go against right and history at the same time and win ever. And what I suspect now is that we are at a point in which this country has come to an intersection in which the winds of history and what is right are blowing in the same direction. And that, I think, will be the liberation for the first time of this country. And I think that's yet to be realized. In other words, I think people fear a second Reconstruction period. And look at Obama. If you look at the opposition, and I don't mean him as a person, but him as a historical reality, which is, say, an African-American president, catching the kind of flack that he catch only and purely because he's an African-American. And yet, though, because of who he is a historical figure. And I don't want to put him in the same breath, but not unlike Malcolm, not unlike King, not unlike Mandela. And already I said Mandela extraordinary because we're talking about a whole country there. In other words, Mandela was another example of South Africa had gone against right and imprisoning him, but the winds of history was blowing for colonization. Then the winds did not shift, but what is right intersected with what is historic. And that is when the South African government and apartheid collapsed, because the forces of history lined up with the forces of right. And I think in this country, for the very first time, I think I see the possibility that the forces of history and right are lining up. So I think it's a good time for this to be happening. Now, and I think, but one has to be aware of that. Look at Obama. He is frustrating the bejeebies out of everybody who's up against him, not because he's a genius, but because the winds of history is on his side. Bill Clinton can't bring himself to say that what the facts are. The facts are that Obama and his team, that they are tactical genius. There's no question. What they've done is the work of a tactical genius at work here. I'm talking about not him, pure and simple, but the team. All right? The Axelrods, the people who got him elected in the first instance. And though I think that people like Bill Clinton looks at this and says, he's lucky. Well, he's not lucky. He's smart and he's tactical. Clinton says he's luckier than a dog with 2 dicks. Then only Clinton, only Bill Clinton would come up with a statement. You know, he says luckier than a dog, but he's not lucky. He's a brilliant tactician, and people don't get it. I mean, I said this to a group of mainstream African American, some ministers, some young, some not so young, and I said this maybe 4 years ago. I said, "This guy's a tactical genius." They said, "I don't believe you're saying that." They did. But if you look at him, like Obama, and I'm no Obama boy, I'm no sycophant for him. I'm a journalist. I mean, I know how to, I've judged, you know, I mean, I've been covering political campaigns since, you know, and watching them since 1976 as a journalist, you know, and, you know, either as an editor or as a reporter, you know, every presidential campaign that has happened up until, 2008. So I know how these things work. National editor and a national correspondent, you know, and I've run a 14-person Washington bureau, one of the best in the country. So I know how these things work. I've run the state operation of Newsday. So I know these things work as an editor. So, but looking at it, I'm saying that this guy, and there have been some other people. I think D'Amato was pretty good. Bill Clinton himself, you know, was a very good political tactician, and he had the personality to match his time. But this guy, Obama and his team has outdone him. I mean, you know, here, remember in 2008, I know we're drifting on the subject, but in 2008, Clinton machine was approaching $100 million. They were looking beyond Super Tuesday. They were looking way beyond Obama. They had an 18-point lead on him, you know, in 2007. I interviewed both of them, you know, the Trotter Group. I interviewed them in a small room, both Senator Clinton and Senator Obama, you know, in August of 2007. And at that point, I think Hillary Clinton had like a 18-point lead on him. So at the end of the day, now we all know, is that the Clinton machine, they don't know what hit them. Even now, they're wandering around wondering what hit them in 2008. But it's not just Bill and Hillary Clinton, you know, who rolled over by this tactical tank. It's like Tiger Woods coming out and winning by 18 strokes, you know, at the Masters. I mean, and I think it was Nicholas who said something like, you know, he's playing a game that we're not familiar with. You know, and I think that, and this is, but then he has to play the game because he didn't. He never would be president. We need a journalism that can address this. I look at television, and one of the frustrations is not so much that, I mean, I think that journalists are capable of covering, and I know I'm drifting, covering what their experience, vision, perception allow them to cover. They cannot go beyond that. But it's just like when I covered South Africa. You know, when I got over there 3.5 months later, I found out that all of these white reporters, 300 odd who had been covering, had never talked to the Africans. 73% of the population of South Africa was African. They didn't talk to them. So you have a Soweto uprising, and yet the people who were doing the uprising essentially had not been reported on. They only reported on Helen Sisman and the Boers, and they talked to all the white people. I'm talking about the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, all of these people, all these correspondents. For 3.5 months, they had not talked to them. You know, because the access had been denied to them. And but this pattern is repeated over and over again, you know, and so that's one of the great shortcomings of journalism then, now, and going forward. I hope we can get rid of it.
In an online interview, you stated that you can never go back to South Africa because of news stories you wrote. You also stated that you counted yourself as extremely lucky to have been able to get out alive. Sadly, in the years that have passed, journalists from across the globe have not been as fortunate. A total of 70 journalists were killed in 2013. The motives for those killings were confirmed, but 25 additional journalists were killed the same year. Mm-hmm. And the motives for those murders have not been confirmed. Would you say it's far more dangerous to be a journalist today than when you were doing regular reports?
Probably. I mean, I can't quantify that. I think that, and I was one of the charter members of that committee to protect journalists, by the way. What has happened is that there are a lot of journalists who've been killed, but unfortunately many people don't count the local journalists, the journalists in Libya, the journalists in South America, journalists in all of these hotspots. They've been killed over the years, so we don't know how many were killed before the committee and others began to take account of it. So it's hard to say. Marie Colby, I know there were 2 journalists that we knew well in Syria, who killed, within the last couple of years. Very, very dangerous spot. Covering foreign warfare, has always been dangerous. But I think that, on the other hand, there are journalists who, and I include myself, that there was a time, and I'll admit it at this point, that if a story didn't have an element of danger to it, it didn't really interest me. There are journalists who are that way. It's just like people go into boxing. There are some people who simply want to go and cover the court day in and day out, but there are other people who get excited. The juices begin to flow once there's an element of danger. That's the way I was, and I appreciated that when I became an editor, and I became an editor in 1981 as a national editor, been an editor since then. I appreciated reporters who, despite the danger, because if you can keep reporters away from area that's dangerous, war, the underworld, criminal activities, what's the point of journalism? I mean, you have to go into dangerous situations, because reporting really is getting information from people who are very powerful who don't want to give you that information, and some of them will kill you. If you're going to get it. I'll give you an example from my own example of getting into trouble. Clearly got in trouble many times on the heroin trail in Corsica. I've been run out of 6 countries. 3 of them at gunpoint. As a reporter for work that I was doing. I was run out of Haiti by the Tom Macoute. During the regime of Jean-Claude Duvalier. I was there to investigate what he was doing with the $15 million of U.S. aid money. I was run out by the Tom Macoute from there. I was run out of Uganda by the State Research Bureau, which is Idi Amin's people. Once he was at war with Tanzania, Julius Nyerere had sent 40,000 troops in, was chasing them out. I was run out of there at gunpoint by the State Research Bureau. They knocked them out of war and said, come with me. I'm going to go into the gory details. I was run out of Corsica by the men of Marcel Franzese, who was the top drug smuggler in the world at that point. It's a Corsican. And I'd gone to Corsica to report on him, which was not very smart. I must admit, especially since I didn't speak French, but I went at any rate. I've written about this. It's online, by the way. And I was thrown out of Rhodesia, back when it was Rhodesia, thrown out of South Africa. So I think that I was fortunate in that sense. And I'll tell you, the closer that I've come, and I'll stop on this with the editor, is that, and here's a challenge for journalists, and here's how the danger element comes into play. In 2003, President Bush and Vice President Cheney and Rumsfeld had decided that they were going to send troops into Iraq. They had found some weapons of mass destruction in the New York Times. Judith Miller wrote that there were, because she was talking to a man named Chalabi, who was beaten alive. And therefore, the New York Times, certainly Judith Miller, were complicit, in spreading this false information that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and created the illusion that Saddam Hussein had something to do with the people who attacked the World Trade Center, which he did not. Once they had decided to finally go into Iraq, they said all Americans should get out of Iraq, including reporters. So the New York Times, and we have 2 reporters there. I have a reporter and photographer there. And so I get a call. Now I run the foreign operation. I'm assistant manager, but I run the foreign operation. The editor had no interest in foreign news. He kind of hoped it would go away. He liked the Washington Bureau, but he didn't like foreign news. He liked local news. So anyway, I was given free hand to run the foreign. I built the foreign desk, at Newsday. Matt McAllister and Moises Salman. Matt McAllister is the reporter, and Moises Salman is the photographer. So they sent me a letter that said, by the time you wake up, you will read the New York Times and others crossing the border. Get them out of here. We would like permission to stay because this is an important story. U.S. troops will be, and if we are not here witnessing it, then we will be left at the mercy of the question you started with earlier, which is the honest reporters, which cannot report on itself, or those, and he said this in his email, who are embedded, those reporters who were embedded with U.S. troops. In other words, they would go in with the troops. They were already there, so they wanted to stay there. I clearly wanted to allow them to stay there, but I had to convince the editor, who would be I knew would be less inclined, because he didn't like any of that rough stuff. And so I called up these 2 reporters, put them on conference call, sat down, talked to the editor, and told him I want them to stay there, But we talked on the phone. And the editor was there. And so we said, the dangers are these. A, the U.S. is getting ready to invade Iraq. So the Iraqis are not going to be very happy with American reporters, period. America is bombing their country into desert dust. And you happen to be an American, a reporter, but you're an American. So you're going to be in trouble simply because you're an American, representing an American newspaper, Newsday. So that's a danger. The other danger is that bombs are indiscriminate. They don't say, oh, you're American. This one we were intended for, the Al-Qaeda. The other danger is that the secret police of Saddam Hussein is not going to be very happy. Their intelligence is not going to be happy with Americans, including reports. So I said, you've got triple danger. And so we discussed each of those. And he said, yeah, we understand that, but still we would like to stay. And now the reason why, I'll tell you, I wanted to allow this particular reporter to stay is because he was what we in the Army, keep in mind I was in the Army for 6 years, I'm a Vietnam veteran. And I said, well, he has been, quote unquote, battle tested. Where had he been battle tested? He had been in Afghanistan. He had been shot at in the West Bank by Israeli soldiers. They had marched machine guns against their vehicle. He had also been in Northern Ireland during the skirmish. So he had a sense, Matt McAllister had a sense of how to report and operate. He's not bulletproof. Right. He kind of knows how to take care of himself. And so given that, if he had just been a rookie, just wanted to do it for dare and do, I may have said no. But because it was McAllister, I said yes. And we let him stay there. Now, he was arrested. He disappeared. They were arrested by the Mukhabarat. The Mukhabarat is the secret police of Saddam Hussein. They arrested him. And for a while there, we didn't know whether they were out of touch. And by this time, American reporters had returned with embeds and all that stuff. So we had reporters searching for them, and we couldn't find them for a couple of days. Now, I'm the one who gave that. So obviously, I'm getting no sleep now. And I have these two young men, and they were young. One was late 20s, even, early 30s and late 20s, that I had given permission after they had requested to stay there. And the U.S. is bombing. And so we found out they had disappeared. There was no sign of them in that hotel room that had swept clean, that they were hauled away, and they were put in Abu Ghraib by the Mukhabarat. And so we began to operate on get all glory details, but they were arrested for 8 days. And during that place, they were Mukhabarat, and we did a headline on the paper. I have it on the other wall, and it said, we thought we would be killed at any moment. For 8 days, they were in that prison where the killing had started. And luckily, they got out on April 1st, across the Syrian border. This is how it works. Reporters, they know there's danger, we're willing to take that danger. In fact, one of the lines he said, he says, I intend to spend my later years with my grandkids, on my knee. He says, but I think this story is too important to be left to the reporters who are embedded and to the irregulars, which is to say the Amish version of reporters. And this is the details of how it works. I've been involved on both sides of it, as a reporter and, as an editor. That's as close as I've come. Now, anything that happened to those guys is, I'm sure that, what happened to Anthony Shadid, the New York Times reporter. Now, he died of what they said may have been an asthma attack because they crossed the border with mules and he was allergic to it and da-da-da. But at the end of the day, the editor, knew about it, was responsible for that reporter who ended up getting killed. The same way with Maria Covini, who got killed with a bomb, that blew up.
Richard Bloom.
Yeah, the list is endless. And hundreds of local reporters, who and we use these reporters, foreign correspondents because you can't report in a foreign country, without using local reporters because you don't speak the language. Even if you speak the language, you don't know the culture. And even if you know the culture, you don't have access, so you have to use a lot of these local reporters. And some of them are called fixers, but some of them are regular, and they're very, very courageous. Very extraordinary courageous. I ran with, a good half dozen of them in South Africa. Enoch Duma, who was arrested after I left. So it's very dangerous work. But reporting is simply finding out information that is accurate, verified, relevant, that someone powerful wants to keep secret. Usually your government.
You're citing the Bush administration, but is it fair to say that most administrations operate in that way? including the current one? Well, transparency has always been difficult?
Some are tough than others. You could always, before, you could take the photographs of the bodies that came back to, I forget the name of that fort in Maryland, that the bodies would fly back from overseas. Right. You could always take photos. And you couldn't take photos from there anymore. Yeah, some are worse than others. Yeah, I mean, I think the Bush administration, the Johnson administration, all of these war-torn administration. I mean, the Obama administration with the drones. This is a whole new kind of thing. I think it's national policy. It's the American foreign policy, which is the action of a quote-unquote superpower unchallenged in many ways. But I cite the administration because it was, in fact, the Bush administration that did that. If there had been some other administration, I would have cited them. I don't mean that they were worse than anybody else, but they didn't do that. So, other administrations have done other things, but they didn't invade Iraq looking for weapons of mass destruction that they should have known didn't exist. The Bush administration did that. Other administrations is bad, sure. Vietnam War was senseless and ill-conceived and never should have happened, whether it was Kennedy or LBJ.
In addition to being killed, more and more journalists in America and abroad are being arrested, having their equipment confiscated or destroyed, and imprisoned without receiving a trial. In August of 2013, the Huffington Post reported that Alan Rusbridger, editor of the United Kingdom's The Guardian newspaper, wrote an article about how UK GCHQ intelligence agency's security experts entered the office and oversaw the destruction of hard drives. Previously, the security officials demanded that the newspaper turn over any and all information pertaining to Edward Snowden. Mm-hmm. When looking at this case, and the fact that the Washington Post and other news agencies filed suit against the National Security Agency for tracking phone calls, are you unequivocally convinced that full-scale efforts are underway to dismantle the Fourth Estate?
If we're not careful. Well, there's always been extreme pressure periodically because the government sees a legitimate, bona fide, committed press as being its enemy. And they're right, and they should be right, at least in theory. One of the things we're supposed to do is to hold them accountable, to be a watchdog, as the cliche go, on the government. That's one of our roles, one of our chief roles. And so they see us as the enemy. So when we're doing our work, Richard Nixon was pretty strong, against the press. He had a plan to just smash it. He had an enemies list. We had all of the press reporters on it, that made it include Newsday. So periodically we get points in which the government blatantly gets bold and comes out when they think that they have the winds to their back and clamp down on the press. I think we're seeing that again. So I think there is a constant attempt to suppress the press, to seduce the press, to manipulate the press, to wear the press down. So there's constant pressure from government. And what protection we have, which goes to your point, is First Amendment here in this country, which Congress shall make no laws abridging, freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And those few 73 words or whatever it is, that First Amendment, is what stand between us, and we have to make that law. But when you get a Supreme Court, like the one we have, the Roberts Court, and there have been other courts, that don't always see the importance of the First Amendment. So, yes, I don't think that we're at the brink of being wiped out, but I think that there is continuing pressure. I think we're going through one of those periods in which I think it has been intense. As far as the UK is concerned, I think the thing we need to keep in mind with the UK, and I remember when we were up at Boston, on a panel with Chris Hedges, and there's a Secrecy Act in Britain, which does not allow this. There's no First Amendment in Britain. In the UK, there is no First Amendment. There is a Secrecy Act. So it is illegal to do some of the things that we can do, at least with the protection of the First Amendment here. Over there, it's not a question of eroding, the press's responsibility. In fact, when the quote-unquote founders came here, one of the reasons I'm sure, when you look at James Madison and others, they spent so much time talking about, the First Amendment is because they wanted to get away from that British system, the UK system. So that's what the First Amendment was all about. So yes, I think that there's constant pressure. B, periodically it gets intense. C, I think we're going through one of those periods now. But I've got to tell you, my main concern is erosion of the freedom from the inside. And that is, we do it by neglect. We do it by, when I say we, I'm talking about what now passes for the media. You know, I can't just say the press, because the press usually means the newspaper, but it's now in media, which means broadcast, TV, radio, all together. You know, supermarket tabloids stand on equal footing with New York Times and Newsday. But I think that media has been taken over by corporate interests. When I got in the newspaper business in 1969, there was something like 750 daily newspapers, all right? And many of them were in private hands. They began to make a lot of money. And so corporations, which is about making money, look and say, oh, these are cash cows. So they began to buy up newspapers, you know, and consolidate, which is that magic word we see now happening with television or with media on the FCC. They began to consolidate it. You know, New York Times has owned a bunch of papers. Times, Mirror, Tribune, you know, these media conglomerates. And so they began to consolidate the paper, and they began to be taken over by corporations. The goal of corporations is to make profit, period. No other goal. Make money for their stockholders. That's all they do. And so what happens is, to give you an example of Newsday, is that Newsday, when I first got there, was privately owned by Payne, and Newsday was bought in 1970 by Times Mirror, you know, which expanded. Then in 2000 it was bought by Tribune. So corporation had taken over. And the effect of that is that, I give you but one example, 2006. This is correct, not your question, but it's from the inside. It's still the effect on the media. Is that Newsday in 2006 made $100 million in operating profits. All right, on a revenue of $660 million. So it was operating whatever the percentage that works out to. Let's say it's 15% in 2006, where you know the economy hadn't collapsed, but I mean it was, you know, the interest rate was pretty low, so that's a pretty good income. I mean, it was making like, let's say I'm making this figure up, but whatever, $100 million on a revenue of $660 million, 16% return on your dollar. That was not enough. They wanted 25% return. They, Tribune, wanted 25% on the dollar. So what did they do to get 25%? Well, they cut staff. They got rid of the foreign desk. They got rid of the national desk. They got rid of the health and science desk. They got rid of New York Newsday. So they could get that profit return up to 25, 30, and 30%. Unbelievable. In fact, in that same year, Rupert Murdoch looked at it. He wanted to buy Newsday later on. Because, you know, he doesn't make his money on the newspapers. You know, that's an ego trip for him, Rupert Murdoch of the New York Post. And New York Post loses about $50 million. And he said, for the record, he said, well, you know, the thinking was that if he were to buy Newsday, Newsday had an operating profit of $100 million. So he said, buy Newsday, merge it with the Post. The Post loses $50 million a year. Because, you know, nobody advertising it. You know, because it's a rag, nobody believes it. You know, but it has no credibility. And, you know, but I'm talking about even during their good days. But it's a weapon in the hand of its own. You know, he uses that to reward his friends and punish his enemies, and it has been a weapon. Murdoch understood that, whereas he made his money elsewhere in television and other operations. You know, owning the Los Angeles Dodgers, movie studios and stuff. So he said, well, if I were to buy Newsday, you know, I could, you know, the Post loses $50 million, Newsday makes $100 million, I'm $50 million ahead. So that's greed. So as a result of that greed, corporate greed, that's just one example of how it works. As a result of Tribune's corporate greed, Newsday now has no foreign desks. It has no national desks. It has essentially no health and science desks. And it has laid off many so that the company can make 25% profit. So what is happening is that this First Amendment right is being threatened. In addition to the government pressure, it is a pressure from its corporate owners. And I think that when you look at television, you see consolidation having the very same effect. I left Newsday because my view is that, you know, Charlie Rangel notwithstanding, I think the job of managers, particularly of black managers and black achievers in companies like that, is to bring diversity. So that's why we organized the National Association of Black Journalists. When I got to Newsday, I formed the Black Caucus at Newsday within the 8 months of being there. I formed the Black Caucus. There were only 8 of us, and we said we got to get more black people here. They got to get in position. They got to get promoted. They got to da-da-da. So my view is to, in addition to doing great journalism, I think was also to make sure that African American men and women get involved in this process, which is crucial to the democracy, to help inform people. So, and I worked, for my 38 years of doing it. But I think that also the job of the manager is to prepare people behind him, in my case. All right? I prepared whites and blacks. I always believe that you have to train people coming behind you. And so I had prepared generations behind me. I had a group of editors, for instance, and I've been an editor since I've been an editor for 25 years. I had a group of editors behind me, white and black, that were 10 years younger than me. I had a group that were 15 years younger than me, and a group 20 years younger than me. These are people that I had worked 25 years, black men and women, but mainly they happen to have been men, because black men are the ones who get short-shrifted in these corporations because, they're intimidating. And so they were 5 deep. And so I prepared them to take over. Every job that I had, like I started, covering Babylon Town. Dele Olajetti started, I started him on Babylon Town. I went from there to cover affirmative action. Sid Cassess covered affirmative action. I became national editor. After me, I named Lonnie Isabel national editor. I created the foreign desk. Dele Olajetti, foreign editor. All right. Assistant manager and editor, Lonnie Isabel. Calvin Lawrence. All right. When I became the New York editor, Reggie Thomas. And when I left Newsday, I put in my resignation in 2003, and they rejected it. The publisher called me in and asked me not to resign. He said, he needed me to help him to get the paper. And I wasn't bluffing. I put in my resignation. I told my wife, family, and everybody. And so I agreed to stay on a little bit longer to help stabilize, because there was a new publisher that was coming in. He wanted me to help him stabilize Newsday until da-da-da-da-da. I stayed on, for 2.5 years. I wanted to get on with my life. I want to write books. I didn't want to teach, but I prepared people.
There are a number of online reports or news stories, and they were conflicting because there are people who were outright claiming you were fired.
No, I was not fired. Now the news that my column, was stopped. That may be because I think that there's no question, but my column, which was a pain in the ass, I got more hate mail than anybody at the paper. There's no question about it. I got tons of hate mail, and I think though when the Dolans bought it, the Dolans who owned the Knicks and they owned Madison Square Garden, and they bought Newsday, I knew the days of my column were limited.
Writing was on the wall.
Yeah, because they don't know anything about journalism. They don't know much about basketball either. Clearly, but they didn't know anything about journalism. But also, not only did they know anything about journalism, they had the power, and they were clearly did not see what value a column like mine had on Newsday, which is a conservative, white majority kind of organization. The column was stopped, but my work as an editor, I resigned, was asked to stay on, and I agreed to stay on, for a few years more to help stabilize the paper.
Is there anyone in broadcast news that you believe is or has the potential to be the next Edward R. Murrow?
Oh, God. Well, it has changed so much. Wait a minute. You mean in broadcast news?
In broadcast news.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know. It would be unfair for me to try to answer that because I don't know. See, if I were at a newspaper, I could spot the potential. That was one of the things I think any good leader, any good manager should be able, when someone walks through the door, and not be limited by it, but to spot that potential and hopefully to try to develop it. And I just don't know television or broadcast well enough to know of people doing that kind of digging. I think, we could certainly use them. I'm sure that maybe yourself, the kind of stuff that kind of angling what Edward R. Murrow represents to me and what keen reporting, represents to me is someone who is willing to risk life and limb and commit himself or herself to ferreting out information from powerful sources, information powerful sources want to keep secret, to understand what the First Amendment is, to pursue it and to stand up for it, to not be cowed by government, which is what he represented, to not be cowed by even the military when they want one version of how the war is going. So I'm sure they're out there. See, I'm not one of these, let me just go on the record to say, I'm not one of these old fogies who believe that there was a golden age in journalism. See, my view is that even with all Murrow, there was no golden age. Even Woodward and Bernstein, we talk about all the great, the golden age hasn't arrived. I think that journalists today know more about the technology. They have more information at their fingertips than we could get from our librarians in a week. They are smarter. They are, in many cases, as widely read, though not necessarily as deeply, because my generation was educated on books. We weren't educated on videos. We weren't educated on on visual kind of digestion of information. So I think though that for their generation, sure, I think that the golden age of journalism is coming upon us. I don't know who all they are. I think this technology will allow them to do stuff that we couldn't even dream of. The kind of thing that I would have to risk life and limb and travel to get at. People can get that, and then the next step is going beyond that. So I think that this is a very exciting time, for journalists. And I don't know who all the names are, and I don't know, but I'm sure that there's more than enough, because I have children, and I'm encouraged by what they know. I'm not like the parent who thinks, A, how tough he had it, and B, how much they did. That's all bullshit. There was no golden age in journalism. I don't think we've seen the golden age of journalism yet. Even Ed Murrow. He was like one guy. Woodward Bernstein. Like I noticed in Washington, they talk about Bob Woodward and Bernstein. He was two reporters, and they were not even covering the government. They were police reporters. They weren't covering the government, because the people who covered the government said they didn't believe him at all. They said, "Come on, I don't believe Martha Mitchell, John Mitchell, Attorney General. John Mitchell didn't do that. I would have known. They didn't know anything. He took this police reporters who came from another beat to report that. You see, they were irregular. So, just like all the work that I've done, and God knows I've been up against the New York Times as a reporter and as an editor. I've been up against the New York Times, which is the gold standard. And I tell you, they're woefully incomplete. They're good as far as they go, but they're woefully incomplete. You'll see it in the book about the New York Times and others on the South Africa story, and on other stories as well. I'll give you one example on the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. And I wrote a book on this called The Life and Death of the 70th Liberation Army. Patty Hearst was kidnapped on February 4th, 1974. Again, Newsday had no national deaths to speak of except in Washington. So I raised my hand and said, I want to cover that. So I had, because of my story, I had a reputation. So the editor said, fine. So I went out to cover the story. Now, unfortunately, I didn't go out right away, because they didn't let me go right away. She was kidnapped. I left there 3 weeks later, so there had been the story on the front page of all these papers. So I got up there and started covering the story. And so I was covering the Patty Hearst kidnapping. She was kidnapped on January 1st, and she was missing for a year and a half. They did not catch her, and the people who kidnapped her, which she had been converted until September of 1975. So all this period, year and a half roughly, she's missing. Nobody knows. 300 FBI agents looking, they really were looking for her. They were not, they couldn't find her. So I'm out there and I write a story, and so I'm boring. And the New York Times has, not only do they have many national bureaus, but they have a 3-person bureau in San Francisco. So I go out there and up against all of these reporters from all over the world. And so I make contact, what came to be known as the missing heiress. That was Patty Hearst. I made contact with the group that was holding her. I had an idea. No one knew where she was, where they were, And so I said, well, for this to really be bigger than Newsday, I should try to see if I can get a book contract out of this. All right. In addition, I write it for Newsday. Oh, no, maybe I wouldn't write it. Well, it depends on the terms. So I made contact with him, and I went to my literary agent, Sterling Lord, who's still around. Long is very the top literary agency at that point. So I went to him and told him that I was going to make contact with the group that was holding Patty Hearst that the FBI couldn't find. That I was going to, I wanted him to see if he could make contact with a paperback book so that I would go and do this interview with Patty Hearst and put it in this magazine and or paperback book. So, he set it up. So he set up an interview with this woman whose name was Hershey. She was the editor of a magazine. So we would do the magazine story first and then the book, paperback book. And so me and my literary agent, we had these secret codes, whereas I remember one time I said, okay, I'll call you and I will give you I will call you at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. No, 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. This is one thing. I call you at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. I'm going to give you a phone number backwards. And you call it, reverse it, and you call it, and then that'll be this payphone booth that I'm going to be at, out on Long Island. And then he would give me and Sam. We had all these phones.
Just in operation.
Yeah. And so we hooked this up and had this meeting. And then we set up this meeting with this editor who was of this magazine, Ladies Home Journal, I think it was. And so we had this meeting in my agent's office, and we talked over the terms of this. And I found out later that if we were there on Tuesday, Wednesday, the FBI was at my literary agent's office and said, "We understand you were talking to someone about the missing heiress." All right? And he couldn't deny it, because obviously he knew that, they were on to him. The story I want to make about the Times is this. When finally she was busted, okay, nobody knows where she was. Patty Hearst, I think it was September 1975. She was busted with two of her captors, Bill and Emily Harris and Wendy Yoshimura. They were busted out on the West Coast. And they had been living out there, right? And so my story, everybody was saying, this is a huge story. Patty Hearst and that picture of her handcuffed being taken off the police and da-da-da-da-da. And so I was on Long Island at that point, back on Long Island. And so, in fact, I was driving to the city with my wife and heard on the radio that Patty Hearst has been found. Bam! Everything went wild. So I dropped my wife out, came back, went into the office. And so I wrote a sidebar. And the sidebar, our big story said da-da-da-da-da. And my sidebar, the lead of my sidebar, you can look it up, it says, Patty Hearst has written a book. Dave Scott said that Patty Hearst has written a book. All right. So everybody want to know, how the hell do you know that Patty Hearst has written a book, And so nobody could match that, and this story got played. 2 months later, when the feds had gone through the apartment where she was arrested, and they had done a complete inventory of everything in the house. And of course, they leaked it to the New York Times, which is what they do. The New York Times, it was a mainstream paper. So I was on the West Coast by this point, doing follow-up stories. And so the New York Times beat everybody. The feds have conducted a complete inventory of the apartment where Patty Hearst was captured with Wendy Yoshimura and da-da-da-da-da, and there was this and there was that. And then magically, the New York Times said there was no evidence of a book or a journal. So my editor, I'm talking to him, he said, well, the New York Times is coming out tomorrow, because that paper used to come out at 11 o'clock at night. And that story is saying that there's no evidence of a book, which had been my lead, I said, don't worry about it. New York Times, well, they know. 2 days later, you can look it up, the feds amended their inventory. The New York Times, with egg on their face, said, oh, the inventory has been amended. And among the findings is a 280-page handwritten journal by Patty Hearst. So this New York, this vaunted New York Times, as with the South Africa. The New York Times reporting that 250 Africans were killed. Look it up. 250 Africans were killed. All right. When I went over there, the bottom line, I'll give you a gory detail. It's in the write-up. I said I got accounted for names, dates, and ages of 853, saying that this list is not complete. And then the New York Times, what did they do? Because I knew someone on the copy desk, magically they began to say more than 600 without saying. But before that, it was like 250. So what I'm saying is that this is no golden age. Every time I went up against them, just like the people I was mentioning earlier about Mad and Salman staying back in Iraq, the government told them to get out. Similar with Grenada, with the invasion of Grenada. Mm-hmm. My reporter went in. I said, look, I want you to get into Grenada. He said, well, all the reporters have been kicked out. I said, I want you in Grenada. He said, you mean Barbados? I said, no, I don't mean Barbados. That's where all the reporters were. I said, Grenada. He took a plane to one of those islands out there and commandeered 2 fishing boats, and he sailed in. And I think that technology will allow you to do this stuff, and that's the kind of execution, not talking about it, but that's the kind of execution that people can continue. There's nothing, I won't say there's nothing to stop me, but there's a different set of circumstances, and it'll be a whole lot easier. But the whole idea is that, the journalism really wasn't that great. I mean, we get big stories wrong, and the problem is with journalism, and something they have to be careful of, is that they correct their own test papers. That's the problem. And not only do they correct their own test papers, they write the tests. So they grade themselves. Now, if, for instance, what I mean by this in terms of race and racism, if the fire department does not have enough blacks or Latinos, they say, well, there's only 3% blacks on the fire department. I tell you that. If, the FBI is only 3%. But what about if the New York Times doesn't have enough? Yeah, I can tell you that. It was Wall Street Journal. No, there's none for us. So I think there's a good career to be made in a courageous critique of the media. Now, that's something that I think someone can do, with a blog, to critique the media, ongoing. Someone who has experience. In fact, I may get into that right.
I'm going to throw some names at you, and I'd like you to sum up their legacies in a sentence or two.
Okay. A sentence or two, an emphasis. I'll be, okay, I can do that.
Charles Stone.
You mean Chuck Stone? Chuck Stone, an imaginative, creative administrator and a stalwart in terms of organizing institutionally against racism in media.
Gil Noble.
An independent, uncompromising broadcast journalist who never forgot where he came from and never gave up the battle to make broadcast media, and by extension, America, a more open place, more fair, more just.
Bill McCreary.
Clearly a pioneer in broadcast journalism with a vision to see where and how America would be a better place if it could reduce the almost toxic level of black exclusion.
Max Robinson.
Max Robinson was a pioneer, anchorman, who did well by the position that he gained, and he also realized how he came to be an anchor person. He never forgot that. It wasn't simply because he was brighter, smarter, as eloquent, and he was, but it was also because people had struggled, people had rioted, people had, in some cases, bled, and in some fewer cases had died to make sure that there was someone, who was an anchor on network television. I think he did the position proud.
Sue Simmons.
Well, Sue Simmons had an extraordinary, what I understand is a Q rating, which is to say she had a likability that perplexed people who didn't want her to be liked and did not want her to survive. I think that she was a strong voice and a strong presence on television where it does not simply matter what you say or even how you say it. What matters is your likability. And I think that her likability on television was extraordinary and accounted for her longevity, which mystified a lot of people. Not me, because I know a lot of people who, I don't want to call any names, who were glued to the tube, because television demands not simply that you be eloquent, but it demands that you be believable and that you be likable. And I think that she had that quadruple.
You've launched a company called LV Payne Enterprises. What made you start it, and what do you hope to accomplish?
Well, on the one hand, I want to write books. I think that we need to get down in permanent form, however it's read, whether it's electronically or otherwise. Those of us who've been privileged enough to have my kind of experience, I think we have to take time out and write them down in a permanent fashion. So I want to write books. I want to have a vehicle to influence younger generations by using younger people. And I would want to have an archive of some of the stories that I've been privileged to cover, some of the people I've been privileged to meet, and some of the exclusive contacts that I've gathered over the years. I want it not to be lost, and the only way to do that is to call time out and to produce it yourself, which is what I want to do, and I think the technology now allows you to do that.
And finally, given everything we've discussed about the state of journalism in and outside of America, What would you say to journalism students who feel that the rules and world have changed too much for anyone to make a difference through traditional journalism?
Well, take it to the next step. I think they can take it to the next step and learn from the shortcomings and the mistakes that quote traditional journalism unquote operate with. By that I mean I think clearly, the time has come when you don't have to cut down trees, to get the word printed to circulate to people. You don't need printing presses. You don't need a lot of trucks to deliver it. What I would advise a young journalist, to do is to learn a foreign language, at least one, to master a foreign language, at least one, to master another region of the world, not their own, to master and learn economics, because I think that's one of the great weaknesses of journalism is economics, the ability, I don't mean business, I mean to understand economics. And I would advise them to maintain their sense of integrity and work hard, but also work smart.
I've followed you from the days of Sunday Edition with the late Jim Jensen until now, and I consider this episode a significant highlight in my career as a journalist. Thank you very much for granting me this opportunity, sir.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure being here, and I'll keep watching and keep listening.
Thank you very much for joining me for this very special edition of the G-Man Interviews. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.